Dan, that was great on the clippings. The fact that they were the fleet were clipping newspapers or having them clipped so assiduously saved me just months and months of work, because when you go chez les flics, archive dans la préfecture de police, when I was working on Émile Henry, or when I was working on Victor Kilbachich, because there were 21 daily newspapers in Paris, as opposed to a couple now, 4 really. L'Équipe, which I buy every day, and in various tabloids, and Libé, and Figaro, Hélas, and Le Monde. And so when you go, so I didn't have to go through 20 newspapers for all the months that I was working on in both 1892, 94, and December 1911 to. When they put their heads through the little window in the Printemps of 13. And so, you get these huge just boxes of all the clippings. I mean, everything's there. I mean, it still took months and months to go through it, but it was tremendous. And then just a comment about Steve's thing, is that when when you're talking about the role of North African workers in particular, and in Nice et ailleurs aussi en plus, you think, I've been trying to read where I was, adding stuff in the history of modern Europe on what happened. It's exactly like the end of World War I, in 1919, besides being the bloodiest year for lynchings in the U.S. But, in France, you had all, the famous Senegalese tireurs, and you had, people from all over the place, and they're brought in to haul things around, and they get killed in the trenches, and then there are riots against them in 1919, and they said, well, get the F out of here, and they have nowhere to go. And so it's exactly the same thing. It's just exactly the same reflex. So that was all just 2 little mini comments. But merci à tous les 4.
Oh, thank you. Just wonderful papers. Just a comment about yours, Keko, and about, you made a couple of comments. One about the importance of wood-based industry well into the 19th century, but also the comparative rarity of arson. One of the most common fires of all, of course, are those started by charcoal burners, who are the people who are producing the fuel. And therein lies the problem that you alluded to about how you know whether fires are accidental or arson. I mean, there are cases that I know of, for example, during the really fraught political years of the Second Republic, where the authorities are convinced that fires have been set deliberately, but once they start making accusations to the left and arresting people, of course the excuse can be, well, no, it's charcoal burners who've let things get out of hand. So, I think it's a wonderful theme that you're exploring, but it's an extraordinarily difficult one, because arson carried out effectively is such a difficult crime to nail down in terms of motive, isn't it?
Yeah, and you don't, if you carried it out successfully, no one will ever know. So.
Right.
Oh, by the way, let me just say, well, there's the silence, that I realized that it was not the Notre Dame football team. But it's an indication of how certain of John's students who don't follow football were at a slight disadvantage relative to those who did. But the one time that John gave me a very effusive compliment was when he had me over to his house with a bunch of other grad students for lunch, and he made lamb, and out in the yard all the men were playing football, and John discovered that actually I had a really mean spiral. And he said, oh, you can throw a football. And I was in high esteem from that moment.
I have a couple of questions, and you don't have to answer all of them. The first is for Dan. When you said that library, what did you say about clippings being the cutting edge of library practice? Could you explain a little bit what you meant? In other words, was you weren't just
Oh, I wasn't just. I wasn't making a pun. No, I just realized what a terrible. I just realized what a terrible pun that. I know. Totally unintended.
But what did you mean about the relationship between the development of these clipping files and library practice? Is there a point when they stop doing it? Do they decide what subjects they're going to do, what sort of from day to day? They say this is an important subject and we're going to start clippings on it. How one ends up with these collections seems almost entirely, not almost entirely
Well, if
random.
I'd had more time, I would have quoted there. So, it was just because I was thinking about clippings and I had to give this talk. I thought, I'll be able to dash something. That I started doing searches in library science journals, and in both French and they're some of the French ones. A lot of them are on Gallica. Well, a lot of them aren't, but a lot of them are. It seems to me, and I think that those clippings those vertical files that so impressed Yvan Audin in 1926 in Ann Arbor were probably still there when John was a student. The moment when articles appear about weeding out clippings files, vertical files, it's the 60s. It's the late 60s. If I'd had more time, I would have quoted a hilarious article by, I think she was the head librarian for one of the San Diego newspapers, about, what was it called? Thinning out vertical clippings files by the 7 R's. And the only 2 of the R's that I remember offhand are restraint and relinquishment, which I thought was a wonderful kind of library science euphemism for, throw it away. I had a couple of passing references that, again, I didn't have time to develop to hyperlinks. But I do really think, and then that idea of the fichier total, I really do think that this was the kind of, in the interwar period seems to have been when it really took off. And I think it was a kind of prelude, to the internet. I mean, to the web. Yeah.
I'll go ahead and ask my other question, which is to Jennifer. What's at stake for you in saying non-state actors? Why is that phrase? I mean, it's an odd phrase, and I assume that there's a whole argument behind it, which I'm curious about.
Well, it's not originally my phrase, I should start by saying, and it has a lot to do with the fact that often when we study questions, and I should say that I myself am borrowing it from Stoller's and Laura Stoller's use of non-state actors, because often when we study the question of imperial structures and we talk about sex, it's all about power and control, and that is seeing through the eyes of the state about how you regulate things. And so often the people we're actually studying are the people who have a direct engagement in colonial administration and government. So it's the bureaucrats who are setting the tone, and possibly also the settlers who have a stake in reinforcing certain norms in their communities. But what we don't often find, especially with questions of, again, passion in the archives, are all the people who are in fact not trying to run a state or to see through the eyes of the state, but simply to live their everyday lives and the question of their experiences. And so then you start to get into people who are non-state actors in the sense that they are not attempting to act for or through the state, but rather to just live their everyday lives, and then they are confronted with the state. And so they are non-state actors in this case.
I was going to say I teach in the political science department, and
I
teach in the political science department, and actors and non-state actors, state actors and non-state actors is just common jargon in political science.
Right, but it's a slightly artificial, a thoroughly artificial separation, right, between a state actor and So much of the area in between is gray.
Well, there has to be some separation if you're not in the government, right?
So you just mean by state actors, you just mean people who are in...
Usually they're people who are formally part of the bureaucracy or of the administration, or they could be police, or they could be surveillance. And then in the gray zone, you'll have people, for example, such as informants, who are both working for themselves and for the state. And then you'll have a less gray zone, which are people who are not officially affiliated with the state, but who are subjected to its policies and laws and procedures and government. Yeah.
Do you have other questions?
Thank you, and thanks to everyone for their papers. My question is for Jennifer. And Jennifer, I thought it was a terrific paper, really fabulous. And I have a question for you. If you could talk a little bit more about the certificate of Bonne Vie et Mœurs, and whether that was specific to colonial administrations, because what it resembles to me is some of the work that I've been doing in the police archives with white papers. And what I've been looking at is looking for lesbians, basically, in the police archives in the sort of 1940s, 50s, 60s. And a lot of the things that you were describing were kind of similar in that the way that they were trying to identify whether these women had bonne vie et mœurs was also through these processes of looking for gossip and rumor and interviewing neighbors and all of this kind of stuff. So I wanted to know more about that document.
So my understanding is that it's not specific to the colonial space and that you have it everywhere, but that because it's always the way it's produced, and I've looked into this a little bit, is that the police would do the investigation and then the certificate would come from like a mayor's office or an hôtel de ville or whatever the local government is. So in that sense, it's going to be heavily influenced by the concerns of the local police and local government, which could mean something different depending on which town or city or area you're looking at. So when you get into the archives and you come across the Bonne Vie et Mœurs, you're going to see it in two ways. You're going to see the actual document, which is super specific. I mean, by the time I'm working in the 1930s, they're often still filled out by hand, but it's typewritten along the left column. And it's, name, birth, whether they're married or not. And then incredibly specific descriptions often. So in that sense, it's very much the physiognomy, which is a lot like a police report for any other kind of suspect. And then as you get down, you get to the part where they start to describe the enquête that they went through and what they found and anything that could be suspicious. And in the end, right, the main thing was, the most important thing for a woman is going to be things such as whether or not they had been paid for sex, right? So that's the thing they're really looking for. But I found, and then the other thing that you'll find in the archives, though, are the police reports themselves, which are thicker and which are really interesting. And occasionally, the women who resist and write back and say, well, that's false, that's a lie. And that's where I get into it, because I'm really interested in when the women talk back. And you'll find, I've never found anything that's directly talking about lesbians. However, I have found things like one woman who mostly had male visitors. And the mostly becomes, as you know, when you track these kinds of rumors to the archives, a suggestion that some of the people who are visiting her and are inappropriate and are making loud noises in the middle of the night, which is what her neighbors are complaining about, are in fact other women. So then you get these small traces where that comes in. And the fact that they wanted to put that in the report, in the official report, is, I think, really important. So I haven't found anything overt, but I found implicit references to other forms of sexuality as well, and which also then go into the reports. So those are the two ways it seems to build up. And then they have to produce that certificate, especially if they're getting married to someone in the... Yeah, it says Certificat de Bonne Vie et Mœurs. And if you're getting married to someone in the administration or in the military in particular, you need that certificate. Sometimes families will just ask for it to be produced. They'll essentially spy on their future daughter-in-law. And then if you're asking for money, they want specific bonne vie et mœurs. And this becomes a tension between the métropole and the colonies, because the métropole wants you to justify that the woman has this bonne vie before they will reimburse the passage home, for example, for indigents. But the colonies are like, she's indésirable if we keep her here. She's going to start sleeping with men who aren't white. So we want you to pay for her no matter what to get out of here. So it becomes a real tension about who's going to pay for these passages. And a lot of the certificates are produced in that particular tension.
Interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. I also have a question for Jennifer. I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about the kind of familial dimensions of your story, your people. I've bumped into a few people that you are interested, the kind of people that you're interested in, right? And I've often found that these sorts of affairs almost always involve some sort of intervention by sort of male family, right? Often the father, right? I mean, often a bureaucratic decision is justified based on the intervention of a father's, right, of the father. But, you know, it's also, there are some unexpected dimensions to this. Sometimes, you know, the families of white French women are intervening to beg to allow the tirailleurs Indo-Chinois, for example, to stay in France. I even found a very interesting case of a French woman who was going to Indochina to reunite with her lover, and it was the Vietnamese family who was really, really opposed to her coming, right? Because in this case, they had a particular perception of her class as, you know, being of a lower class, and this was a very elite kind of Vietnamese family, right? So there's always a familial dimension, right? And often in the archives, right, you have families intervening. So I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about how that sort of plays into your story.
Yes, I'd be happy to. One of the things that drives a lot of the reports you find about, so I'm really interested in what I call independent female mobility. That's not me, my term, that's actually Cohen and Verdovic, but it's this sort of mobility where women are not dependent upon a man while they're moving about. And so that's the mobility at stake here. But of course there are always men in their stories. The point is not, it's just that their drive is independent. And so the family comes up a lot, and when you have these sort of recherche dans l'intérêt des familles, so when you're trying to track a family member who has disappeared in the empire, which happens a surprising amount, including those who truly disappear. And the thing about those recherches is that they are often initiated by patriarchs. It's often the father or the brother or man who's looking for this woman. And women have the right to refuse to have their address communicated back home, which is one of the really intriguing tensions. You don't have to accept to be found. You can be found and then say, they can say we found them but we won't communicate the address, or we found them but they refuse to let you know anything more about this. So I think that the families play a pretty serious role in a lot of cases, but for example, the case of Paulette that I talked about, this is all her. She has the support of some of her local administrators who are saying help her out and so forth, but it's not any other family member. And I've also come across some of the cases post-World War I where the families, the army is actually going there and saying, don't let your daughters marry these men, and the families are saying, yeah, but he knows how to milk a cow. I don't really care where he comes from. And that's a literal quote that I found. and so I think that's where it becomes really interesting, that sometimes the families are in fact fully supportive of these kinds of relationships, and sometimes they're the ones trying to put an end to them. And I've seen both in the archives.
Any other questions? Well, let's thank our panelists.
Thank you. Jennifer, how does that interface with casier judiciaire? Are they the same casier?